Welcome to Procurious's Bravo podcast series, celebrating women in procurement. I'm Hugo Britt, Content Director for Procurious, and I'm delighted to be a part of this series sponsored by Telstra, featuring inspirational stories and career tips from 5 women with some very valuable advice to share. Julie Masters has spent a career decoding influence. She is the founder and CEO of Influence Nation, working with business leaders and organizations to become the voice of authority in their space. She also hosts a podcast called Inside Influence that dives into the nuts and bolts of how to own your voice and then use it to drive a movement, a conversation, an industry, or a nation. Julie regularly advises CEOs, entrepreneurs, and executive teams on how to dominate their marketplace by turning their expertise into influence. Julie's joining us today to talk about something that can take a great deal of courage, becoming an epic storyteller. Welcome, Julie.
Thank you for having me.
So everyone enjoys hearing a good story down at the pub or catching up on a great story in a book or on Netflix, but I'm increasingly hearing that the ability to tell a story is a critical skill in our professional lives as well. Why is that?
I think it's essentially because we're wired for story as human beings. If you think about the last thing you read, the last thing you engaged with, the last thing you clicked on, the last thing you remembered, or the last thing that you retold somebody else, I would put money on the fact that they would have all been stories. And I think we're bombarded with so much information now. A stat that I heard recently is that every day more information is created than existed from the dawn of time to 2013. And that's just every day. And so we've got all this information being streamed at us, which ironically doesn't really work because we're not logical, linear creatures at our very heart. We're storytelling creatures. We're wired for story. Story is how we engage. Story is how we connect. Story is the only way that you build empathy and connection with somebody else. I tell you my story, you tell me yours. If you look back at tribal days, even when 2 tribes didn't have language in common, they didn't even understand each other, they would sit and they would share story, because it's just the act of hearing a story drops you into a level of trust with somebody else. And that emotion that only story can create is pretty much the primary ingredient needed for people to take action. So definitely, if you want anybody to take action from the information that you're looking to share or the change that you're looking to create, then story has to be an essential part of your communications armory.
Great. So talking about taking action and actionable takeaways, it'd be great if we could give some tips during this podcast for our listeners. So what are your tips for telling a great story in person? So, for example, when I'm up on stage, I never know what to do with my hands.
I don't think you're the only one. If you watch any videos of me, you'll notice that my hands are generally everywhere. For telling a great story in person, the first tip that I would give you, which is not sexy, and that's structure. I think we often put far too much kudos on how we tell a story, or how we present, or how we put over an idea or a message, and not nearly enough focus on how we structure that message in the first place. Some of the most intelligent people, some of the most interesting ideas, some of the most groundbreaking pieces of information have fallen flat because they weren't structured in a way that's going to compel attention. So firstly, I would look at how you structure that presentation. Are you starting off with a clear intention in a way that's going to get my attention? Then have you managed to get your information or your story into its main points? And are you using useful case studies or useful examples to illustrate those points, examples that I can relate to? And then finally, does your story have a clear ending? And this one flies under the radar all too often. What do you want us to do with your story as a result of your story? Is there something that you want us to do differently, know, behave differently, believe differently? So firstly, structure. Secondly, delivery. And there's some, we could talk about delivery all day, from the basics to the fine arts of neurolinguistic programming and timelines and how you move your body. But the basics would be, don't go too fast, number one. Because one of the key things that we do when we're nervous is we speed up. So slow down, take a breath, remember to pause, especially remember to pause after you've made what's an important point. Because our brains take a while to catch up with where you're at. And if you just keep on talking, we're going to miss the fact that you believed that part was important. So take a breath, pause. Secondly, don't be afraid to be still. The impact is often in the variance. And what I mean by that is if you're constantly moving, it's a bit like the sound of a washing machine. It's constant, so we tune out. If you're constantly moving, eventually we kind of tune out. If you're stood still and rigid, eventually we're going to tune out. So use your body for impact. Move at certain points if you're illustrating a point, and then stand still and ground down. And use your hands to make the next point. So using a variety of different ways of using your body. That's the second one. And the third one, I would say, is your voice. Again, variety is the key. So if you try not to have, a monotone voice, monotone delivery, try and up the energy of your voice or up the volume of your voice and then bring it back down again. These are all the tools that you have to get and maintain our attention. And at the very beginnings of this podcast, you mentioned Netflix, which I thought was fantastic, because I was talking to, on the podcast that I have, I was talking to one of the head of the labs at Google recently, a lab called Unskippable Labs, and they study what makes stories, in particular advertising stories, compelling, basically makes them unskippable, because we're living in an age now where people can literally skip your ads after 5 seconds. And so they started studying it, and he talks about the Netflix effect, and the Netflix effect being that our brains are literally being rewired now for story. We spend our time watching Netflix, we spend our time consuming story after story on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, you name it. And so we're becoming story connoisseurs in a way. And so you need to start watching these, like watch Netflix, but watch it with an eye for story. How do they do it? What do they do in the first 20 seconds of a compelling story? What do they do after that point? It is a formula. And so if you're curious, watch more telly, which is not really something I would tell many people, but if you're curious...
No, I like the sound of that, yeah.
If you're curious, get curious. What makes an epic story? What was the last story that caught your attention? What was the last story that lost your attention? What was the last story that you retold over dinner? What ingredients did it have?
Oh, that's fascinating. So you've made me very aware of my own voice now as I'm talking, but what about when you're telling a story through a written medium, such as if you're trying your hand at a blog article or trying to compose an important email?
Similar rules apply in terms of having a structure. I think probably what becomes more important when the medium is written is bearing in mind attention spans. Because there are things that widen attention spans. Movement widens our attention span. Sound widens our attention span. All the different senses widen our attention span. But if you're just using one, and that's visual, so it's a written medium, the level of attention span that you're working with is going to be so much smaller. So get to the point fast. Usually, start out with a compelling first sentence. What's the core question that you're looking to answer? What's the core idea? What was the moment it occurred to you? Start out with a high impact first sentence and then get to the guts of it quickly. So, again, if we're going to get technical, I would never suggest more than a couple of paragraphs before you get to the meat of what it is that you're saying. And then break it down. Again, this is where structure comes in. So a couple of paragraphs potentially, And then, if you start out with a core question, what are the keys to epic storytelling? A couple of paragraphs as to why epic storytelling is important, high impact information. And then number one, it is this, short description why. Number two, it is this. Number three, it is this. And then a brief conclusion. There are certain form. I'm a big fan of long form versus short form. I'm a terrible tweeter. Check out my Twitter profile, you will see. I love long form. My podcast is an hour long. I've written ebooks, and I have worked primarily in the speaking world, and that's an hour long. Speeches are an hour long, traditionally. However, I think that if you're looking to get and keep attention, short and sharp and high impact is the way in. That's usually when someone goes, this person's really interesting. They know what they're talking about. And then you've earned the right to put together a larger white paper that people will read, or an ebook, or an actual book that people will read. So I think that short form is now the key, or the channel in to getting people engaged enough to consume your long form written content, because we tend not to dive straight into long form anymore as a result of those diminishing attention spans that I was talking about.
Fantastic. So my last question, Julie, would be your tips on how to start and end a great story. You've touched a bit on this already, but can you have a quick advice on what can be the two things that people struggle most with?
I think starting is, you could start with a question. Starting with a question, that's always a powerful way to start. As I said, what are the keys to epic storytelling? Why have human attention spans dipped? What are the keys to lead generation in a digital age? And if you start with a compelling enough question, even if you don't use that question, it's going to guide your story into a really interesting space, as opposed to just general information provision. It's going to guide it into a really useful space. So I think starting with a question usually gets people's attention super fast. I was reading an amazing journalist recently who had spent a lot of time analyzing Elon Musk's presentations, especially when he was launching new products or pieces of software, millions of people watching. And he said that one of the key things that those successful presentations had in common was he started with either an opportunity or a threat. And again, if you want to kick into our primal brain and make an impact, if you start with an opportunity or a threat, usually, again, catches our attention because you're delving straight into self-interest. So I would start there with a question, an opportunity, a threat, something that's going to grab our attention from the beginnings. And to finish, I would call that, you need to close on purpose. And it's one of the primary mistakes I see storytellers make all of the time, presenters, influencers make all of the time. And that is, you're so relieved or you're so, over it by the time you get to the end of your story, regardless of the format, that you just finish. Full stop, the end. And there's no call to action. There's nothing that you want me to do. No, I've just given you the benefit of my attention for however long. And I was obviously interested enough to keep going. And so it's almost, by just finishing with no purpose, you're kind of robbing me of the opportunity to put anything that you've said into action, which I obviously want to do because I've been with you the whole way through. As an example of this, I was watching a documentary on whales a while ago. And I watched this documentary for an hour. It was absolutely captivating, and it was about the endangerment of whales. And at the end, it just finished. Credits rolled. And I was sat there and I was thinking, but what do you want me to do? Like, what do you want me to? I would have done anything. Just give me something. Give me something. Do you want me to buy a certain type of product? Do you want me to donate? Do you want me to tell people about? Like, what do you want me to do? You've got me now. And so close on purpose. Close with some kind of a request. Close with some illuminating, as Nancy Duarte says, was one of the creators of An Inconvenient Truth, Al Gore's incredible presentation, which turned into a movie. She said, you need to illuminate a path. That's what you're there for. So illuminate a path forward for somebody. Give them something to do. Give them a request. Give them an invitation. Anything, so that they can take the effort and the intention and the energy that you've put into the story and use it to better themselves, their own lives, their own careers, their own pathway in one way, shape, or form.
Oh, that's excellent advice. Well, that brings us to the end of this particular story. So, Julie, thank you so much for joining us today.
You're very welcome.
Thank you for listening to the Bravo podcast series sponsored by Telstra. This series will be made available in the Procurious Learning section.